Okay, so now we're picking back up where we left off from the last video. We're going to go into requirement number 2. So if you're new to this channel and you would like to follow along with the curriculum, the link is in the description. It is free. You don't have to register or anything. But I would like if you subscribe to the channel and like the videos and comment. That'd be awesome. So let's get into it. Requirement number 2. Requirement: return -1 if the transmission does not contain these two colons within the string. Next, we have a negative test requirement that tells us that should happen if the data is invalid. Before jumping into the code, let's review the steps we took to implement requirement number 1. 1. Create a blank test function. 2. Give the test a name that is a clear testable statement. 3. Come up with test data that will trigger the described behavior. 4. Think about what is needed, then write code that fulfills the stated behavior. 5. Run the test and see the if it fails. Or I guess I mean that. Run the test and see that it fails. A typo right there. 6. Implement the new code or feature used in the test. 7. Run the test and see it pass. 8. Review to see if refactor is needed. Now, for requirement number 2, the solution for steps 1 through 4 can be seen on line 11 through 14 right here. Now, what we've done here is that we've imported the file from the actual, the function from the actual file, which is processor.js. Then we created the describe function that's going to describe what the function is doing inside of processor.js. We got 2 arguments. We have a statement that tells exactly what the function is doing, transmission processor. Then we have a function that takes in the 2 tests that are going to test the behavior, or to make sure the use cases are tested and that we're getting the information we need. Again, the purpose of writing these tests, or TDD, before you write the function is basically, like we said, get an understanding. We need to make sure that we are coming up with the information that we want to add to the function by thinking through the whole process before we write the function. This is just going to make you a better, stronger developer. I'm not going to say better, but it just helps you get a strong understanding of the code that you're writing. Now, for step 5, run the test and see it fail. Notice that -1 was the expected value, but the actual value was an empty object. And so we did the expected. We created a variable to store the result in. You're going to do this a lot in your testing. What we're expecting whatever is in this result variable to be the object. Then again, we're actually passing in some data, and we're expecting -1 because it doesn't have those colons. So when you create the function, you're going to write the function that this has to be included. Now, next in step 6, we write code that will make the test pass. Go to processor.js and update the processor function to check the transmission argument for the presence of the colons. So this is what you're going to write. You're going to write transmission dot. So we're passing in the function. We're passing in what? This is the parameter because we have the keyword function. That means we're defining the function. If the transmission, which is this variable or this parameter, which we're making this dynamic, nothing is being hard coded, and we're using the dot index of method, and we're passing in the string colon colon, and it has to be less than 0. So what we're saying is, if transmission and at the index of what these colons are is less than 0, meaning that this doesn't exist. If that's true, then return -1. And on the outside, remember, we have return an empty object. Once it hits this return, if this is not true, it hits this return right there, and then we're done. Once it hits this return, it's done. Remember that. And then don't forget, we got to export this out. Now, lucky, step 7 is to run the test again. They should both pass. Because why? Because we wrote the test here to handle those instances right here, to handle this conditional and handle this object, right? Return the object, the empty object. But this is what this is looking for. Return an object. Now, finally, step 8 is to review the code to see if it needs to be refactored. As with the first requirement, our code is quite simple and cannot be improved at this time. So everything is good so far. So now let's get to requirement 3. Requirement: returned object should contain an ID property. The ID is the part of the transmission before the colon. Now this is another part, right? It's a lot just for this one little function, right? To cover all these tests that we're writing is really just coming up with your pattern, your thought pattern on how you're going to write this function. By understanding how to write the test for the functions, first you got to understand functions. Then when you're writing the test, it just really helps you understand, okay, these are the things my function needs. This is how I want this function to behave. I'm thinking about the use cases before I write the function, instead of writing the function and then later on I do the use cases. That's where your code coverage, we talked about code coverage earlier, I introduced that to you, may be very low because you didn't talk about different use cases. So there's software out there that can test your code coverage. Did you think about all the different use cases for this particular function? And when it runs the function for you, it's going to give you a number that says, okay, you're at 20% code coverage, because the test that you wrote is only touching one thing, which the software is letting you know there's more use cases you need to think about. All right. So the same steps will be followed, even though they are not explicitly listed. All right. See line 16 through 19. To see the test added for this requirement, to test this case not to be undefined, that's another method for the test that we're using, was used, which is checking if the two values are not equal. Not to be defined is used to make sure that result.id is not equal to undefined. Remember that if you reference a property on an object that does not exist, undefined is returned. So here we're adding some more test case here. Now we're writing return ID in object. So we have the function here. We created the same result, the same variable result, processor. We're passing in the string. This time we have those colons in it. Expected result ID dot not dot to be undefined. This is what we want. And we don't want it to make sure that it's not equal to undefined, because if we do not define that property, we're going to get an undefined, and then that test will fail if it's undefined. It'll let you know your test is failing because you did not define the property. Now, the fail message looks a little different than what we have seen. The phrase expected actual to be strictly unequal to let us know that the two values were equal when we didn't expect them to be. The object returned from processor doesn't have an ID property. We need to split the transmission on the colons and then add that value to the object with the key ID. See solution and processor.js below. So here, what did we do? Like I said, we're checking right here. We're running a check. Whenever you think of conditionals, we're checking something. So we're checking to make sure that this is going to check our condition to make sure that the index up is there. If it's not there, then we're going to get a data is invalid. That's why we have the note in here. Sometimes this is when we put comments into our code. This is just to let you know what you're doing with this particular conditional, which we don't write these in our code because it actually takes up space. But the reality of it is when you're creating your code, you add these little notes in just to remind yourself of what you wanted to do. But then when we get into the refactor phase again, when you're done with everything, you'll clean all this stuff up. So now we created another variable, this time called parts, transmission.split. So we're using the method split. We want to split on this delimiter here, the two colons, then return ID parts 1. So what is this saying? That this is going to have an index at zeros, because we know that it's 3 parts. You have the ID, you have the semicolons, and then you have the actual data, the value. And then we export that. Then we run the test again. That did it. The test passed. So it's passing because we are covering the use case. Line 6 splits transmission into parts array, and line 8 assigns the first entry in the array to the key ID. Now remember, with this split, we know that the transmission is a string. And so to make it an array, we have to use split. Split uses a delimiter. This right here splits it on this particular delimiter, which are the the colons, the double colons. Now in requirement 4, the ID property should be of type number. Okay, again, the same steps are followed through, though not listed. Now, what are you thinking when we say the ID property should be of type number? Think about, what do you need to use to make sure that it's converted to a number? So now we got that test. We're going to write the test, converts ID to a number. We have the function. This is the result that we're storing in process, coming from the process, the process function. We have that string. All of this is a collection inside the string. Then we have the result.id to be this number right here. So when we get over to, here we go, the function, what did we add? We made sure that we return ID, the key now, and we want to convert that over to parts 0, which is that index 0, which will be the first part of the actual string. And like I said, that split, it breaks this down and is using this right here, the double colons as the delimiter. It splits on these 3. So now this is 3 parts, and now we can control that we want this to be a number instead of a string. And then it says, now for the great feeling of passing the test. You may be wondering, what happens if that data is bad and the ID can't be turned into a number? That is a negative test case related to this feature, and it's left for you to address it in the final section. Okay. Requirement number 5. Requirement return object should contain a raw data property. The raw data is the part of the transmission after the double colons. New tests to be added to the test processor test.js. Now we're going to create the test. We got the 2 arguments, a string that describes what the test is, this particular test is going to do. We have the variable result. We have the function processor. We pass in the information or the argument that we want inside a processor. Now expected result.raw data not to be undefined. These are the things we're writing, right? We haven't written it yet, but this is what we want to do, our test code coverage. This is helping with our code coverage. Let's run the test again to see where we are at. We need to extract the raw data from the second half of the transmission string after it's been split. Then return that in the object. So here we have the function, and now we have the parts, transmission fluid. Now we have the raw data. Where's the raw data coming in? It's in parts 1. So this is a delimiter, remember? So we got 0 and 1. The second part of that string is this. That whole thing is considered the parts of the raw data. It's that time again. Our test passed. Number 6, requirement return -1. The value raw data. If the raw data parts of the transmission does not start with the opening angle bracket and end angle bracket. We call it angle bracket when we're not calling it less than or greater than. Let's think about what test data to use for this requirement. What ways could be transmission's data be invalid? It could be missing the opening angle bracket at the beginning. It could be missing the closing angle bracket at the end. It could be missing both angle brackets. Has an opening angle bracket, but the symbol is in the wrong place. Has a closing angle bracket, but the symbol is in the wrong place. All of these cases need to be covered by a test. Let's start with the number 1, which is missing the opening angle bracket at the beginning. New test to be added, the test processor.test.js. So here we go. So we write the test, returns negative for raw data if missing the angle bracket, opening angle bracket at position 0. We create the function, we have the results, and what did we do? We gave the example right here for the string. And this is what we're expecting, result.raw data. That's a property. Now we know it's a property because it doesn't have parentheses for 1, and we know that it's a part of the object. And that property has data associated with it. But it doesn't have the right data because this is going to be negative because we don't have an opening angle bracket. So when you run the test and review the failed message, then you go through and look at the failed message to see how to fix it. Now add new code to the processor.js to make this test pass. Note that we don't simply return -1. The requirement is to return the object and set the value of raw data to -1. So here we go. So we've written here, we got another check, another conditional, right? Raw data at 0 index, because now we're in the raw data part of it, not the whole entire string. We're at the raw data, not the parts. Remember, the raw data, and it has parts 1. So that's stored in the raw data. Now we take raw data and we're breaking that raw data down by saying that at the 0 index, if it's not equal to this opening angle bracket, raw data is equal to or assigned to number 1, right? Like a -1. And then we do the return. If all of this is not, if this is right here false, then it's going to jump down to this return ID number parts. And we want to convert that to a number, raw data, and we're passing in the raw data. We want the keys of the raw data. And this is the actual raw data that we've created for this variable. Now, you know what's next. Our test passed. So the test data we used was missing an opening angle bracket at the beginning. Add test to cover these cases. -1 should be returned as the value of raw data for all of these. Here's your examples right here. To use TDD to add these features, use the steps demonstrated above to implement all or some of the features below. Take your time. You can do it. 1. Trim leading and trailing white space from transmission. There's a method for that. Return -1 if the ID part of the transmission cannot be converted to a number. Return -1 if more than one colon is found in transmission. Do not include opening or closing angle bracket symbols in the values assigned to raw data. Return -1 for the value of raw data if anything besides numbers are presented between the angle bracket symbol. Okay. All right, this is a long one. This last section was very long. As you can see just from the videos, we're looking at about a good 35-40 minutes just to go through the videos, and compounded on the time that you need to spend playing around with the code. This was a very long section, but we made it to the end, and that's the end of this particular chapter. It's important to understand how to test your code, and what learning how to test your code is going to do is help increase your confidence in writing functions and understanding what use cases you need to cover in your functions. So all it does is you're practicing on how to become more of a stronger developer. Okay, so now that's the end of this section, the end of this chapter. Remember, the more you do, the more you improve. See you in the next chapter.